We're back with the National League this week, and we've had some roster developments as, free agency signings have continued, and we've had a few news items coming in, at least in terms of roster construction. But I'd argue probably the biggest story of the week was what happened with Pat Hoberg, who unfortunately has been fired from being an umpire, which is really terrible for all us baseball fans because he was like the highest graded umpire in ball strike ratio.
Well, he had a perfect game. I remember you saying on a podcast.
Right, he's very, very good.
Where every pitch he called was deemed to be in the proper the proper call over a game.
Unfortunately, he was a Now I don't know.
No, he wasn't the gambler.
Oh, he was.
Shared his account with somebody who was able to, I guess, get information that they normally wouldn't get, and that basically is akin to consorting, if you will,
with gambling.
I don't even know how they ruled it, but basically, and I wrote a post on that this week, that the gambling thing, we won't get into it on this particular podcast, but we're fixing for a big problem, because if this is the stuff we're finding out, what are we not finding out?
There's something way worse lurking there below the surface, and we might not want to know what that is. And then probably in some, obviously there's a lot of fear with the new CBA coming out here in 2026 that we look destined for a lockout coming up next year.
I think I've heard the two words salary cap uttered more in the past week or two, and people are writing about why we shouldn't have a salary cap. Jason Stark of The Athletic made a big pitch going, okay, we don't have a salary cap in baseball, but we'll possibly have 3 football champions in a row. So we want parity in the major leagues. What about the league with a salary cap, the NFL, having a team win 3 years in a row? So does it guarantee you what you want?
That feels like a bit of a disingenuous argument, because I would argue that quarterback in football has a greater sway of outcome over the game from a single player position ratio than any position in baseball. I don't think any one baseball player can affect the outcome of the game as much as a quarterback can affect the outcome of a football game.
Well, and to your point, I think you look at it as, in baseball, what are the chances of the Kansas City Royals winning 3 Major League Baseball World Series in a row? Get this. You would be stunned if that were to happen. If
any
they won,
team,
winning one
and that
now.
used to happen somewhat more regularly. People kind of forget that. There used to be a lot more repeat World Series champions and teams winning, bunches of World Series in a row, and then we got free agency.
Right, free agency. No, the Yankees won the 3 in a row in 98, 99, and 2000.
And that was like the last time that's happened. But I'm saying it used to be a lot more common before. You had teams putting together more. You had dynasty-type teams.
Well, I think in baseball it happened. So it happened at that time. So 25 years ago was the end of the last one. And then the Oakland A's won 3 about 25 years before that. That's kind of interesting. And then before that, you had the Yankees winning in 49 through 53. So it seems that it takes a longer time for that, to happen, but it does
But
happen.
salary cap back then didn't have any kind of the presence of one, or didn't, set it up anymore. I don't think that the presence of the salary cap will or won't influence the parity of the league. That's not why we're putting it in there.
I'm with you on that, and the people that are asking about a salary cap are people like John Fisher, and people that don't want to spend money on their teams.
I was going to say butthurt owners that are upset that they're getting outspent and losing to the Dodgers as a result.
And look, I think we've said it on this podcast, and anybody who follows baseball and like us or like knows the players aren't going to go for this, and then that would be the reason if the owners stand firm on there being some sort of a salary cap and a salary floor.
And they might even be more into this because Trump has floated the idea of eliminating the sports tax for owning a sports team. So that would be affecting all these people who are now going to suddenly have less money on hand than they're used to. They might be looking to cut back on what they're spending a little bit.
Yes, yeah. Well, anyway, so that was big talk this week. I certainly hope there isn't going to be a work stoppage, like you say, after the 26th season. But it's possible.
It is possible. And I think when you look at all those dynasties coming up, do you think this year's Dodgers roster is one that's, starting to carve out a possibility for a dynasty itself?
Haven't the Dodgers already won this year? Isn't it over? Oh, we're gonna play. We're gonna play the season.
We gotta play the whole season, right?
I forgot. Are the Dodgers far and away the best team on paper? Let's just say as we go into spring training, which, by the way, starts today.
Pitchers and catchers are reporting
for the
today
Cubs who
on
play
Sunday,
that first game,
February 9th.
We got about 6 inches of snow here in Connecticut on the ground. So talking about baseball, it's just warming, and I'm thinking about spring training because it is definitely something to look forward to.
Right, and I think if we step away from the Dodgers at the moment because we'll return when we talk about them with the rest of their NL West brethren. We would instead probably start with the NL East, and I think you have to look at the team that, even given their struggles last year and the Phillies' success last year, I think there'd be a lot of people that will be picking the Atlanta Braves to end up winning the NL East, just because when you look at that roster that they have with all these guys coming back, if everybody plays, they're going to be really good.
I went through the roster one by one today, and I can't agree with you more looking at the Braves, which kills me to say that, by the way. Looks like Spencer Strider is going to pitch. He of the brace surgery he had in his elbow, which gets you back into the league faster, as opposed to it being Tommy John. So we need to distinguish between those two now. He is going to pitch in spring training, and so there's thought that while he won't start the season on the active list pitching, this is going to be pretty soon after the season starts, that he'll probably have to work his way into shape a little bit in the minor leagues and then come up. So his being a primary contributor on that team to go along with Chris Sale and Ronaldo Lopez and Schrellenbach, who probably most people don't know of unless you watched him beat the hell out of your team as he did in the Mets last year. That starting rotation, I think where the Braves have a problem on the pitching side, I think the bullpen is shaky.
Right, you like Iglesias in the back there.
Good pitcher.
But you're still not sure what you're getting out of everybody in there. And they're a team that is going, I like all the pieces if they stay healthy. And that's the question of health is one that runs not only through the pitching staff but through their position players.
So Joe Jimenez, a good pitcher, another right-hander, but no Tyler Matzek. The Mets picked up A.J. Minter, the other lefty. So those are the two, and they replaced him with Aaron Bummer. Aaron Bummer, unless they're going to do Braves magic on this guy and all of a sudden he's going to become, an unbelievable pitcher, the bullpen thins out a little bit after there. And so they're going to have to, probably outscore a lot of teams, which I think they'll be able to do.
Right. You would think that, okay, Matt Olson had for him, not nearly as good 2024 as he had good 2023.
It would be hard to do that, though.
But he's a guy that is known for having on-year, off-year, sort of, alternating. So you would hope he's back on his on-year this year. You hope Sean Murphy bounces back and has a better season.
A couple of guys had a bad year. All right, go on.
Right, and I think that the thing that you really have to be stepping through and thinking is how much time are Ozzy Albies, Acuna,
on the disabled
Michael
list,
Harris,
on the injured
all these
list.
guys going to miss because you feel like they're all going to miss at least some percentage of the time with injury because they all always seem to get hurt, and that has to really concern you.
Full strength Braves are awesome.
Right.
That's only Albies and Acuna, like you said, and Austin Riley.
But if they play 15% of their games at full strength, it doesn't matter how good that is.
And they brought over Jurickson Profar, who had about the best walk year a player could. He had a 1-year deal, as you know, so it was a walk year.
Signed a 3-year, $42 million deal with the Braves.
And he's probably the best left fielder they're going to be able to put out there in a long time.
You just hope he doesn't. You hope that his first half of 2024 is what you get, and you don't get the second half Jurickson Profar.
And so, depending on when Acuna Jr. Comes back, you've got Michael Harris, who also had a disappointing year, I think, from what we expected from this player.
He picked up in the second half.
But I expect him to have a better year this year.
Right.
And so if Acuna does come back pretty soon, they've got on the bench then Brian De La Cruz. They brought in from
Miami. He was always a pesky player.
And Kelenic is another guy. So these guys, that's the best thing about the Braves. Those guys don't have to play for them to be good.
Right. And I think that's probably how, if you're a Brave fan, kind of how you'll be looking at this roster and judging how successful it was, is how many games are Jared Kelenic and Brian De La Cruz playing?
Yeah, if they play, less than 60, 70 games
you're good
combined.
If they start creeping up into the 80, 90-plus game range, then I think you might see another equally as frustrating year as to last year, where you're kind of just forced to say, we got to punt it again and hope we can be healthy the next year. And you can only have so many of those years in a row.
And so the Braves, I think, are locked, loaded, focused, and it's hard for them to be as unlucky with injuries as they were last year, a second year in a row. I'll just say that because they were pretty unlucky last year.
But you have to be. There is part of me that you have to be thinking. You have guys like Chris Sale. You have guys like Ozuna. You have some older players on your roster that are big key components of it that
Yeah.
You have to that if you're not able to put it together this year, you can't keep counting on these guys to put together the performances they're doing year in year out. They're gonna avenge Father Time's undefeated for a reason.
Would it be pessimistic to say, can you really expect Chris Sale to have another year of full health and pitch 30 starts or more?
You have to be terrified of that.
Okay, I guess he could do it because he surprised the heck out of everybody last year, winning the Cy Young, by the way. And he's also on a track where he's trying to be a Hall of Fame pitcher because there aren't going to be a whole lot of starters, and we've talked about this in other podcasts, who have a chance at it. And if he has another 2 good years or something like that,
there.
he could possibly get there. So behind the Phillies and maybe
behind the Braves, you mean?
Behind the Braves, let's talk about the Phillies first. Talk about the Mets, after them.
Right, because I think if you were picking the teams in perceived order of strength right now, I probably would be talking about this Phillies team because
Me too.
they're not that changed from the team they were last year, and they were a really good team last year.
I mean, it starts by running out those starting pitchers, much like the Braves, right? And Nola and Zach Wheeler, who's probably been the best pitcher in the National League overall over the past 5 or 6 years. And Christopher Sanchez had a terrific year last year. Ranger Suarez had a great year. They bring over Luzardo,
who's going to be a big help for them.
A good pitcher, and Andrew Painter can be their 6th starter. So
right, the best part is Taijuan Walker is now nowhere near your starting rotation.
yeah, I think Philly fans are pretty happy about that.
If you look at the lineup outside of Kepler now being your starting left fielder, unchanged.
Yeah, and other than older.
Right, they're a year old.
Older than so Real Muto, who is he's only 30. He'll be 34 when the season starts.
That's where you start. Harper is going to be 33
at the end of the year.
At the end of the year, right?
So
when you start
I don't worry about Harper too much.
Trey Turner is going to be 34, 35 in the middle of the year.
Right.
So these are the things you start to think about as Oh no, I'm sorry. Trey Turner will be.
Yeah,
32.
And the other 2 infielders, Alec Boehm and Bryson Stott, I went back and looked at their 2024 seasons. They had pretty good seasons.
Right,
These guys really were good.
I think that you're in the almost frustrating space as a Philly fan that the Oriole fans were sort of in last year, in that you have to watch 162 games of this regular season, and none of it really means anything to you because this team can only be judged on postseason success. And so I think as a fan, you have to not get too high or too low on the team at any one point during the regular season because none of that matters. All that matters for this Philly team is October.
Let's talk about the Philly outfield for a second because that's where I do think they have a little reason to scratch their head. So Max Kepler, I wouldn't consider that a giant move, bringing in Max Kepler.
Lateral, maybe?
And so that pushes Brandon Marsh maybe to center field. Okay, Brandon Marsh is a nice guy, I think, to have on your team, but I don't know if I'd want him to be one of my top 3 outfielders. He's sort of a guy who can play anywhere, great defender.
If he was your 4th outfielder,
yeah,
you'd feel
I would
better.
feel that. I mean, Castellanos in right field. Okay, so I kind of tend to doubt this guy a little bit, but he is the best of your outfielders.
Right, and he shows up every postseason and hits.
Right. So I think if they had anything they were going to try to tinker with, it might be that. It might be the bullpen, that they might look at.
Right, do they really believe in Matt Strom as their closer?
Yeah, and Alvarado, who, to me, Alvarado, if he's coming in a big spot in a big game, I'm a little nervous of him, a Philly fan.
Right.
So I think they have that to be. Jordan Romano comes over from the Blue Jays. I think that's a nice under the radar, which shouldn't be because Romano was their closer.
Right, he struggled.
Guy to bring in. He struggled, but I think that it lengthens because Kirkering is now maybe your 4th guy.
Right, that's a lot better. The less you're using Kirkering, probably the better because they got a little over-reliant on him last season, it felt like.
So I think the outfield is a place to look for the Phillies, but even with that and with the Mets, we'll turn to them for a second, and they finally got the Pete Alonso thing done, and we can talk about that because everybody else wants to talk about that or not.
Yeah, turning to the Mets because I think the Phillies, like we said, they are what they are. They're going to tinker at the deadline, but they are a team like the Braves and like eventually the Dodgers will speak about. The only thing that matters for them is October. And the New York Mets, I think, would like to consider themselves to be in that category as well, which is a really scary thing when you're in a division with 3 teams that think of themselves that way.
Yeah, and they did what they had to do, not just in signing Juan Soto for $765 million.
They got Pete back. They've at least papered over that problem for long enough that a different solution can be found that isn't just sticking Mark Vientos at first base sort of haphazardly.
Yeah, that was never a good plan by the way. And so the Mets, as they're currently constituted with the pitching, and they had a great offseason. I think it's hard to do anything but go, wow, that team really addressed a lot of its needs. They didn't, if you want to be a nitpicker, they didn't get the number one starter at the top of the rotation that you kind of hoped that would happen.
Right, but that just wasn't there in the market for them.
So they got a lot of number two type starters, and you want to call Minaya a number two.
Bringing back Minaya was big, I think.
Is Senga pitched enough for you to say, okay, maybe he's not a one, but is he a number two?
In a year where the Mets win the World Series, he's a number one.
So, and Clay Holmes, we're going to make him into a starter. Well, that certainly doesn't sound like a number one starter to me, and maybe not even number two. So, they've got some guys they've got a lot of guys. So the Mets are going to definitely run a lot of guys out there and hope they can find 5 or 6 guys that can pitch consistently well. And then they've got too many guys, and they can trade the Paul Blackburns and the Cannons,
trade some, make bullpen
the Petersons
guys out
if
of
it
the
doesn't
other,
work out with him. Although they're hoping he'll be something. The bullpen was addressed, right? Bringing back Ryan Stanek, I think was a nice move. Bringing in AJ Minter, like I said, you still got Edwin Diaz there, so that's good. I think at the catching position for the Mets, that's the wild card in my mind for the Mets. If Francisco Alvarez, because there was just a couple of years ago we were talking about him being like one of the up and coming catchers in baseball.
Right, and he had a rough year last year. He did not play well
on both sides of the ball.
On both sides of the ball, and you have a lot of because you have when you look at the Met lineup. It's more of them going from just being a good offense to being best in baseball offense, because you have to have questions about, will Vientos repeat his year from last year, because that was something unexpected that you didn't really count on. What are you going to get out of the second base position? Because Jeff McNeil...
Who are you going to get out of the second base position?
Who's going to be playing second base? What are you going to get out of Jose Siri in center field? You're not expecting much, but...
Defense,
right. Can Harrison Bader have a bounce...
No, he's not a Met anymore.
No, I'm sorry. Brandon Nimmo. Can
yeah.
Brandon Nimmo have a bounce back year in
very
left
important
field?
to the Mets.
Right, because while he was great when they were super hot in June, July, the offense did lose a step when he kind of lost a step due to plantar fasciitis, and obviously we've now got Juan Soto in there. So the construction for the lineup is there. It's just how crazy is it actually going to get? Because if Vientos has a year and Alvarez has a year, Nimmo bounces back.
Like any team, though, like we talk about the Braves, we talk about the Phillies. If they're their best selves, any of those teams, they're going to be juggernauts, all of them.
Well, I think at the same time you could kind of argue against that, because if we look at another team here in the NL East, in the Miami Marlins, I think even if all of those guys had a year in that lineup, it wouldn't make a difference.
It's so funny you went to them next, because I was going to say, so the East is going to beat the heck out of each other, right? All of those teams are going to beat each other up, which is going to put their overall record down a little bit, I think, because of the parity. And let's talk about the Marlins, because I was going to talk about the Nationals first, only because I think the Nationals are going to be better than people think.
Right. I think we could start with the Nationals, because that's a more fair. And I just didn't use them because they're actually a decent.
Their biggest problem is they play in a division with the Mets, the Phillies, and the Braves.
Right. I bet if you stuck the Nationals in the NL Central, you would see a very different national team.
So the Nationals, and they have Mackenzie Gore, who had a surprisingly nice season last year. Jake Irvin, who, from the Mets perspective, the guy looked really good when he pinched against the Mets. So you think he's probably
but he just
maybe even better than he is.
They went out and got Soroka, which is an interesting signing for them.
And that's a shot in the dark, I think. So they're not deep, in the rotation. DJ Hurds and they brought back Trevor Williams.
But they've got some guys that at least give them some solid starting pitchers, and they have guys that can give your team a tough time in a given series.
The bullpen is a little iffy. They don't have Kyle Finnegan, who has yet to sign, by the way, with any team.
Interesting, he's holding out for this long.
I maybe he just didn't want to pitch for the Nationals, so I don't know. But yeah, Derek Law and Jose Ferrer and Eduardo Salazar, and they got in Jorge Lopez just because he's got to be in the National League East, I guess. But the everyday lineup, aside from what I'd say catcher. Because I don't know what the Nationals see in Keibert Ruiz that makes them keep thinking this guy's going to be
because they traded
great.
a lot of he was part of the big deal, so they need him to be good,
and so
they're going to keep giving him a chance.
Didn't have a good year yet last year on either side of the ball. This is the year, right? I always like to say that.
Right. Well, then they went out and they made some fixes. Going out and getting Nathaniel Lau to be your first baseman, I think is a good move. I think Luis Garcia Jr. actually had a pretty exciting year.
Yeah, and there are 3 Luis Garcias in Major League Baseball right now. The pitcher for the Astros who didn't pitch last year, and there's also a pitcher for the Angels, who is pitching. So
and obviously,
good baseball name.
You have a fun C.J. Abrams. He's a fun young shortstop for them. It's just he plays in division with way better shortstops all around, so it's just rough on him.
And doesn't get maybe quite the love and the appreciation that
I think the fact that Ahmed Rosario is going to be your starting third baseman going into the year has to be concerning.
I think they might be looking at Jose Tena. That they have. I think what they're hoping is that he's going to fill in wherever they need him.
Right.
He is a Swiss Army knife in that he can also play outfield.
And obviously, and starting in the outfield, you have James Wood, who was the
key piece in the Juan Soto
trade.
He
showed some exciting stuff last year, but he also showed some not so exciting stuff, especially defensively.
Whereas in center field, Jacob Young can go get it out there. Really good defensive
player. But
can
he hit the ball?
And then they've got this Dylan Cruz guy. Dylan Cruz was the guy who was picked behind Paul Skeens, the Rookie of the Year in the National League, and was thought, wow, I don't know which should we pick, Cruz or should we pick Skeens? So
but everybody just
Skeens.
Everybody
They're sure glad they did.
Right, and they all just forgot about Cruz because Skeens rocketed up and was so successful.
Cruz did not have a good year last year.
No.
So and they if they're going to surprise people, I almost think he's the guy.
Now, and we have to put context on surprise people because the best outcome for them is maybe a team that flirts with 500.
And so that's what I mean. And that would be a far cry better than what they were. In any other year, they might be a bigger threat. But in that loaded NL East,
it's rough.
And this is why Miami, no matter what they do, is going to lose 100 games.
Right. Miami's going to lose 100
We're not picking teams here. We're just saying it's just hard.
Well, it's just hard because you look at this team and there's just not the roster. Just if you went through this roster, and I can do this, if any fan tried to just guess what the Miami Marlin depth chart was going into the season, I would have really struggled to name more than one or two positions.
Yeah, and I don't know what they're doing down there. We obviously everybody can think, okay, Miami, Alcantara, right? Okay, we know Sandy Alcantara is one of the best pitchers.
Name
in baseball.
another player.
Right. Okay, and they had this guy a couple of years ago who pitched well, and then they sent him down when they were heading for the playoffs. Yuri Perez, he's not even in the top 5 on their depth chart for a starting pitcher. So I don't know what the heck they're doing.
Right, and then you get, God forbid, you get to the position players because it's just like outside of. There's just nobody you're even excited about. Maybe Xavier Edwards at shortstop is a guy you're kind of...
I like Xavier Edwards.
Right.
And I think Otto Lopez will surprise you in terms of... I think he had like an ops plus of like 112 or 118 or something like that.
Right, but you're still looking at Jonah Bride at first, right. Connor Norby. Now I remember they had Jacob Stallings for a while, who's always a nice catcher, but he's gone now, and now it's Nick Fortes.
Yeah.
And it's just... You've got a lot of just... Maybe that's what we'll see this year. And maybe the one thing I can say is it looks like they've actually just fully committed to the tear down and rebuild instead of like whatever weird thing.
Didn't they do that already?
Right, I thought they already kind of did it, but at least now it actually seems like they've fully gone.
Well, we're really getting down to the studs here,
Right. There is nothing left.
Speaking of studs, they do have the Marlins do on the roster Griffin Conine.
Is that Jeff's?
That is Jeff's son, and so Jeff Conine is a renowned Marlin, beloved Marlin guy. So, but this guy's 28 years. Will be 28 years old. So it's not like he's this up and coming 22-year-old.
He's like some phenom prospect.
Oh, he finally made it to the majors, and his name is Conine. Let's go watch the Marlins play so that we can watch Conine play. So yeah, it's just hard for the Marlins to do anything, particularly when they're really not putting a lot of money into the team in the first place in a division where that isn't the case, obviously.
And as we go over, we leave the NL East and move over to the Central. I feel it only right we start with the NL Central champion Brewers.
Right. The team I will doubt again this year, probably.
Right. And I will probably doubt them more this year than I doubted them last year. I had a good feeling about them last year. And it's not that they don't have some young, exciting players. Jackson Churio is a very young, very exciting player. He was great for them. Bryce Terang is a speedy leadoff hitter they've got. But they're going to not necessarily miss specifically Willy Adames that much, but they're going to miss his presence in that offense, in that lineup, because, oh, wow, you wonder where this team's going to score.
Well, and doesn't that put more weight on Rhys Hoskins, right, all of a sudden to be even better than he was last year, where I think you kind of looked at it from Milwaukee's standpoint going, hey, we kind of got a year out of Rhys Hoskins. That's cool. Okay, well, now Rhys Hoskins has to be a stud. I don't know if you want to rely on him that much. On Joey Ortiz, this is the year. It just
you're right. You don't like when you're in that situation.
So you're right. Offensively, it's like how are they going to score runs?
Because the pitching is still there.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that because, number one, I went to opening day last year at Citi Field, and Freddie Peralta mystified the Mets, and I thought on the basis of that game, by the way, the Mets were going to have a terrible season. They started 0-5 because he set them off on the wrong foot, whatnot. And then it goes behind. They brought over Nestor Cortez as he came over to the Devin Williams trade.
Right, who's been a guy that, as somebody that's watched him here in New York, I've just been thinking, eventually this carriage is going to turn back into a pumpkin, right?
I'm going to guess my Yankee fan friends are going to say, that they're not necessarily all that upset that Nasty Nestor is going to do his nastiness someplace in the National League.
Right.
And then, Tobias Myers started 28 games last year for them. Had an ERA plus of like 120.
I'm just going to say this. Anytime you lead with the number of games somebody started, that's not
nobody even heard of this guy.
Right, but I'm just saying that's not a good sign for them because if you had anything more impressive, you would have started with that. It's like, oh, yeah, he played in 100 games last season. For a position player, it's like, oh, that's not a good sign.
And so they trade away Devin Williams because they didn't want to pay Devin Williams because he was coming at the end of a contract. And they replaced him with
Trevor McGill.
Well, they didn't replace him. They just
promoted.
Yeah, I guess they gave Trevor McGill.
Kind of what happens to people at work where they just fire your superior and they're like, oh, by the way, we're not going to pay you anymore, but you've got way more responsibility.
Joe Payamps, I think he was a Tiger for a while, who's a decent reliever. Jared Koenig, Brian Hudson, Nick Mears, Elvis Paguero. I mean, who are these guys?
They were the little team that could last year, and I really just wonder, with all the parts that they've stripped away, I mean, I can expect a lot out of Jackson Chourio, but how much can I truly expect out of him? And I think we're going to find out this year.
Now, they do have William Contreras, who, as it turns out, is now the more accomplished of the Contreras brothers catching, duo in the main. Because when Wilson came up for the Cardinals,
it was him.
The Carbs, he was the stud. And now William Contreras had a terrific year last year as one of the MVP kinds of stuff.
They're going to need that again.
They're going to need him to do that again. So they better stay healthy at the very best. And Pat Murphy may not be as fortunate in year 2 as he was in year 1. So what do you want to do next? The Cubs or the Cardinals? I
think I would look at the Cubs next because they're probably the team most people are going to have as being the ones to overtake.
I feel that too.
The Brewers, because they didn't do a ton on the pitching front, obviously, other than going out and getting Ryan Pressley.
And Matthew Boyd comes over from the Detroit Tigers, and he had those short starts where he was sort of the opener, and he's been a decent pitcher in the major leagues. So it'd be interesting to see how they use him this year. I think that's why I mentioned his name.
But obviously the much bigger news for them, because outside they didn't make a ton of moves on the pitching front, is obviously the acquisition of Kyle Tucker.
Well,
that gives them a legitimate superstar in that lineup. So that's a big change for them with a lineup that was solid last year, but you really felt like lacked a bit of punch. Now you got a guy in there to give it to you.
Well, and because Ian Happ had one of those seasons where you go, wow, he had a really good season last year.
He's had a bunch of those now.
So and Pete Crow Armstrong is gonna play out in the outfield for them. If nothing else, Pete can go pick it as well. And you neglected to mention just on the pitching side that they did go and bring in Ryan Pressley.
I said that.
Oh, did you? Okay, because I think that might be the biggest thing that they did on the pitching staff.
Right, it gives you a guy to certainly counter.
They had nobody to give the ball to at the end of the game.
Now you have that in a division where you have some very good closers in it.
So and he wasn't appreciated. He didn't appreciate it when they brought in Josh Hader down in Houston. So now he can be the guy. Catching wise, yeah, that's a problem.
Right, but I feel like that's a problem for most teams. Most teams probably don't look at their catcher and go, "Oh, I'm just thrilled with what we have here right now," because there's only so many good catchers in Major League Baseball at a time.
I think Miguel Amaya is going to probably be the starter because Carson Kelly, came over to support, and he's a guy. If he plays more than 30 or 40 games, you're probably in a little bit of trouble.
Right.
Michael Busch ended up having a nice year for them, coming over from the Dodgers last year. I think he's sort of your first baseman now, and
they're counting on a lot from Nico Horner.
Right.
I think third base is going to be interesting just between Vidal Brujan and
John Birdie. I mean, that's like, we forgot about third base. That's what I think with the Cubs going, darn it, we need somebody out there. Who are these guys?
Oh, yeah, we traded our third baseman. Shoot.
So Dansby Swanson didn't have a great year last year.
But he's still very very good defensively.
Reason to think that he would have a better year this year than last year. So
And you're hoping you get a healthy year out of Seiya Suzuki, and being able to put him at DH full time is going to help
that's
a lot.
I think he's going to do a lot of DHing for them. So and again, the opposite of the NL East, and this is a preview of I think the Cubs are in good shape, and I picked them to win last year, which they didn't do. They did make a fleeting effort. I think the rest of the division just gives them, not a clear path, but a real chance.
Right, because when I look at the other three rosters between the Cardinals, the Pirates, and the Reds, I'm not super inspired by any of those rosters. There's guys I like on each of them, but there's not one of those rosters that excites me.
The biggest personnel change of those three teams is not a player.
It's a manager, you think?
It's Terry Francona managing the Cincinnati Reds.
Because that was a team that everybody's had as their dark horse candidate. They didn't really make a ton.
I pick them every year, and I look like a dummy. I'm going to probably pick them again this year.
Figure it out for years, because as far as the roster, they didn't make a lot of changes. I mean, obvious big change in terms of second base. They got rid of Jonathan India.
That's a big change.
And they brought in Gavin Lux, who I think is a good signing for them. You bring in a guy that can kind of align with Terry.
He's more important on the Reds than he was on the Dodgers.
Right. You can hopefully kind of help everybody focus and become a winning team. Spencer Steer, Ellie De La Cruz. You've got talented.
These are good players.
Right.
Candelario. I expect big things from them this year.
I think Jake Fraley's a much better player than a lot of people in baseball know.
And Tyler Stevenson catching, backed up by Jose Trevino. That's a nice pairing too back there.
Right.
I think that's.
You hope you're going to get another good year out of TJ Friedel. I think that, you probably got, I think, some of the best you could have expected out of him last year. You just don't know if that's going to be who he is going forward.
Spencer Steer is healthy, and I think will be a primary contributor this year. McLean also.
And then, obviously, with the rotation, you go back, and now you've got Hunter Green and Brady Singer. You've got a nice 1-2 punch. So I think when you go and say, bringing in Terry Francona probably positions that team to be sort of the dark horse candidate once again in the NL Central.
I tend to agree with you, because as much as I want to like the Pirates, because I just like the Pirates, I always have liked the Pirates.
I think if you're an older baseball fan,
you just like the black and the gold and the Pirates and the We Are Family thing and all that stuff. Mitch Keller, Skeens, and Jared Jones. That's a nice top three, right? That is rock solid. Bailey Falter, he's one of those guys. He took the ball like 30 times last year, and he pitched okay. So you need a guy like that in your rotation. You'd rather it be a number 5 than a number 4. And Johan Oviedo is your 5th starter there. Good.
David Bednar is a good closer. You have Holderman had an up and down year last year. There's a period where he was otherworldly effective, and then there was the rest of the season after that.
Carmen Muzinski, and of course it doesn't look like I had to look up in Baseball Reference because his name is spelled Mlod. Zinski, and I'm like, I have no idea how to pronounce that name.
Polish boy?
Yeah, and you have to go to Baseball Reference, and they tell you, this is how you pronounce the guy's name, which really helps me out a lot.
But I think the more frightening thing for the Pirates is when you get to the position player part of their team, because, O'Neal Cruz in center field is interesting. Whereas Eli De La Cruz, I have a kind of an idea of what sort of baseball player he is at a baseline. I'm like, okay, at worst, he's going to play pretty good shortstop and be a base stealer. So even if he never develops any other part of the game, I get that value for him. I have no idea what kind of player O'Neal Cruz is at
He was a lot
baseline.
sexier to me when he was a shortstop.
Center field. If he can be a center fielder, that's still a sexy.
Watching him throw the ball, from shortstop, and the guy has.
He's gonna be able to do that in center.
Yeah, he's gonna be able to do it as well. But I just think having a 6'7" guy play shortstop, like Ellie De La Cruz, who's also quite tall. It was intriguing. It was interesting.
And certainly, you would feel a lot better about that switch if they were bringing in a more intriguing replacement other than Isaiah Kiner Falefa.
Yeah.
IKF being your new shortstop is not anything the team is super thrilled about. That's the Yankees from 3 seasons ago.
And they're going to trot out Brian Hayes again at third base. This is the year.
Right. Adam Frazier's had a bunch of nice seasons for them.
Well, he came back, and it's like, the prodigal son comes home, but he's not that great.
right. Spencer Horwitz at first.
Well, that's a nice move, I think, bringing him over from Toronto, because he was kind of wasting away, in
he wasn't
Toronto.
going to do anything there.
Right. So I think that, that's nice. So, I kind of like I feel like that franchise might need a change in mojo. It just feels like, I'm not sure why they'd go into the season, the Pirates, thinking that this is going to be different than last year.
I think what you're probably...
They'll go out 20-8, and then they'll be 20-23.
Right. This year, if you're a Pirate fan, you have Andrew McCutcheon's retirement tour to look forward to, and another year of Paul Skeens. And the only way it changes is if some guy in this lineup has a year you don't expect.
Brian Reynolds, maybe?
G1 Bay, like somebody.
Yeah.
O'Neal Cruz takes to center field and becomes the player we thought he could have been at shortstop.
So, again, and that's a division that, you could make noise in because it's not as stacked as is the NL East.
And just because we do need to mention them, even though they're probably the team I'm least interested in talking about, just because I don't like talking about them to begin with, and their roster is not very fun to talk about. We never talked about the Cardinals.
You're right. We haven't yet talked about the Cardinals. And
you were getting ready to move on to the NLS there.
No, I wasn't yet. And the Cardinals... they didn't trade Nolan Arenado. I think that's a mistake because he doesn't want to play there. They don't seem to want him there. And then you've got that mojo problem again, I just don't know why, the Cardinals, well, they're not putting any money into the team. I mean, that's clearly the case.
Right. That's I think more what it is than anything. And you just look at this team and you look at the roster. It's like, oh, they brought Sonny Gray.
Well, Sonny Gray is the better of the Grays, by the way. He's better than John Gray because I used to get them confused. Sonny Gray actually over the past few years has been, he is their clear number one to me.
Right.
And is a better pitcher than most people think of.
They went out and got Eric Fetty.
That was right. That was from last year.
Right. That was a trade deadline deal, right?
Right. And Miles Mikolas. He's like the little girl with the curls. When he's good, he's very good, and when he's not good, he's terrible.
And they still got Steven Matz.
Yeah, he's and he's been on the Cardinals. This is like I think his fourth season with the Cardinals. I don't think he's ever pitched in more than 18 games as a Cardinal. Well, he just gets hurt all the time.
Right. And obviously, Halsey had an unbelievable season last year.
And they didn't trade him. I thought they were going to.
Right, and it's just. Can you count on him being that good again?
Well, you better because Ryan Fernandez, Matthew Liberatore, Riley O'Brien, John Kinn back him up. These are all guys who, you're hoping for their best season, and if you don't get that, you could have a rough bullpen.
Right, and this is a team that can't afford a rough bullpen because they're not going to score a ton. When you look at this team up and down, I mean, Mason Wynn got a Gold Glove. Did he win the Gold?
No, he didn't. Tovar won it in Colorado.
But Jordan,
he had a good season. Mason Wynn.
Right. But Lars Nootbaar is a good player, but Jordan Walker did not have the year that they were hoping for.
This is the year,
right?
Brendan Donovan, a player I like until you start looking at his stats and you think, I'm not sure why I like him so much. I just like this guy. He plays well against the Mets a lot of the time. So
Alec Burleson is going to be their first baseman.
Yeah, I don't know what they were thinking there.
And I think obviously their whole handling of the Wilson Contreras situation, and I think the William, because I think he was there at one point.
No.
I remember they had a whole thing with one of the Contrerases.
Yeah, well, Wilson came over from the Cubs, and then they basically, were going to take him out of catching because he was doing so poorly that they thought, and of course, his whole value was predicated on being a guy who could hit and play catcher. Right. And so they actually backed off that, and they put him back in a catcher, and he did fine.
Right.
It was a very strange, way to approach that whole situation. And their center fielder, might be Michael Ciani, and if you've not heard of him, you're no different than me because I barely have heard of this guy.
Right, and I think that they're a team that, unlike the Cincinnati Reds, which went and made the impactful manager move, the Cardinals have still inexplicably not made theirs because Ollie Marmol is somehow still manager there.
I don't don't understand.
Well, so. if they're a team that's not spending money, not wanting to pay two managers is extremely emblematic of that.
And that's something that the Cardinal fans are complaining about all the time. So, okay, well, now that we got through finally the Central,
we can go. We will, like the rest of the divisions, we'll go from the top because it's only fair. And let's be frank, nobody really wants to talk about the Colorado Rockies for that long.
I don't want to talk about the Dodgers.
Well, we have to talk about them because they are the best roster in baseball, and they somehow got better.
Yeah, and they had a year last year where some guys that are very good ball players didn't even have particularly great years. I'm talking about Will Smith, who I expect will have, who's still one of the best catchers in baseball and shows up in the playoffs. Didn't have a great regular season last year, unlike Teoscar Hernandez, who did and who does come back. So that does make a big difference.
I think it's just going to be interesting seeing because this team, I think, the one player they truly can't afford an injury to is Betts.
Yeah, well, I would think anybody that has Betts on their roster would not be able to afford.
In particular, because he's playing shortstop right now, but he's also their best. I'm sure they would love to get a different shortstop so he could go play outfield because they can't love the fact that they're going to be starting Conforto and Tommy Edman in the outfield. and Teoscar Hernandez, that's an outfield that could be kind of swingy in terms of its performance.
Well, and you're so right? Because Edman is really an infielder who will play outfield. Conforto, as Met fans remember Conforto as a slightly above average outfielder with a good arm. He's older now. I don't think he's slightly above average. I think he's below average. Hernandez is not a very good, outfielder. Don't they have the center fielder that they
Andy Pages,
Paez, who took the job from James Outman, because all James did when he was batting was make an outman.
Right. Obviously, they've got a ton of other positions. Fine. Max Muncy, Mookie Betts, and Freddie Freeman is your infield, and then whatever you want to do at second base, you're feeling pretty good about that.
Yeah, I think the idea is that they would like to find some place that doesn't wear down Mookie Betts at shortstop for him to play, and they haven't been able to do that, and they haven't been able to bring anybody in yet. And I think that is the only thing, like you said, that could possibly shake their foundation.
Right, would be a Betts injury, because that's the one place where then the knock-on effect it has at other positions if guys start to struggle a little bit. It's way more so than a Freddie Freeman injury or a Shohei injury, which would have an equally devastating impact on the day-to-day lineup, but it wouldn't put pressure on the Dodgers in the same way.
Yeah, I tend to think I've said that if the Dodgers were going to somehow not walk to the division title, and then we get into the tournament, we see what happens, and they're pretty darn good. It would take two of those guys, Shohei, Freeman, or Betts. Two of them miss total of 150 games.
Right, that could have an impact on them.
That could make a difference.
Because when you look at this rotation, they were one of the better they had a good rotation on baseball, and it's like, oh yeah, then they went out and added Blake Snell, Roki Sasaki, and yeah, oh by the way, Shohei Ohtani is going to be back in pitching too.
Yeah, and Kershaw still hasn't signed. I don't think the Dodgers are sitting there going, well, we got to bring in Clayton Kershaw because he's the last piece to our puzzle.
No, that's a signing that's predicated on how much does Kershaw want to play baseball with the Los Angeles Dodgers.
But all those guys who haven't pitched because they've been injured over the years, like Dustin May and
Tony Gonsolin,
these guys, some of these guys are actually going to pitch one day,
right?
And they were pretty darn good when they did pitch, and they're just spare parts,
right? Because you look at this lineup, and they have a legit rotation of almost 5 number ones,
right?
Between Snell, Yamamoto, Glasnow, Ohtani, and Sasaki, those guys would be the number one on a lot of different rotations.
And it feels to me, I think the Mets are in this place, and I think the Dodgers are. That 6-man rotations are going to become the norm based upon the way that baseball is headed right now. That
I don't understand why there would be any kind of why you would look at any kind of team differently for. I don't know other than
older guys can pitch more if they pitch every 6 days.
I just for me it would be I would like to hear the argument about why a 6-man rotation would be a bad thing.
Well, I just think you're asking the pitcher, like I always say, to go out there and pitch balls to the wall for as long as he can. If he only has to do it every 6 days, it's probably better than every 5 days.
Exactly.
So I think the Dodgers it's just the depth overall, and they're so good at that, and that's why teams like the Mets and the Cubs and everybody else are trying to model themselves after the Dodgers, just to have a bunch of depth pieces so that when the invariable injuries happen, we've got guys actually who can play that can come in and replace them.
Well, I think what's interesting is sort of the team that you would expect to be their challenger in the division in the San Diego Padres. They have a lot of answers in their roster, but they also have a lot of weird question marks, kind of centered around the outfield mostly.
Yeah, pitching wise, they've resisted trading Dylan Cease, who I expect, unless they are playing super well and they're in it, I would say he'll be a trade deadline piece, because you got to give up compensation now that you don't have to give up closer to the trade deadline. So, but when you run him and Michael King out there and Darvish and Matt Waldron, who's a nice pitcher, and Joe Musgrove, who's I think injured again. I'm not sure how
he's
much
always injured.
He's always injured. That's pretty good with Robert Suarez out of the bullpen and Jason Adam, who they got from the Tampa Bay Rays last year at the trading deadline. I think their bullpen is good enough. It's just what's going to happen on the infield, because I guess Xander Bogaerts is finally healthy, supposedly, because he had a disaster. Right now, that contract looks like one of the biggest albatrosses in baseball.
It's going to just weigh them down for such a long time.
So, you could talk about the players. Manny Machado, what kind of year is he going to have? Everybody wants them to trade Luis Arias because he wins batting titles, but he's no good. Is pretty much where it comes down to.
He's the least valuable batting champion of all time.
Cronenworth is going to play second, in this lineup, which I think they, will put up with. I don't think bringing in Connor Joe was a big move on the part of the Padres.
No.
But they do have Jackson Merrill and Fernando Tatis Jr.
Right, but yeah, right. Those are your guys who are looking to lead your outfield, and you're looking at the between Tatis and Merrill. That's a good enough outfield that Connor Joe and whatever else is going on in left field shouldn't sink you.
But because of the family dynamics of the Padres ownership and the Seidler family and the fight going on between the children of Peter Seidler about that, you know that A.J. Preller's not going to get any money to spend on the Padres. It just feels like, to me, going into the season, that unless they get off to an incredible start, right, and they just, from the get-go do that, I get the funny feeling this is going to spin downwards more than it's going to go up.
And maybe the team that will benefit most from that is the San Francisco Giants, who I have to give a lot of credit to, in that they were one of the teams that are not the Dodgers or the Mets that actually went out and spent money this offseason and tried to get better.
I think that's true, and they were always the team that the guy didn't sign with at the last minute, and you're like, nah, go someplace else, not the Giants.
Not them.
And I guess if you're a hitter, it's a ballpark that is neutral because it's not Candlestick Park, obviously.
It's not great to hit it.
It's not a great hitting ballpark. Look, when you trot out Logan Webb and Robbie Ray, and there's a guy named Justin Verlander who's going to pitch for them this year, which is interesting.
Interesting. You really don't know what you're going to get out of him.
Jordan Hicks, converted relief pitcher. Kyle Harrison, who I had picked as my NL Rookie of the Year last year, who did not have a Rookie of the Year type season at all.
Comeback Player of the Year.
Yeah, or something like that. I don't think you can do that when you were coming off your rookie year, though. And the bullpen with Tyler Rogers and Ryan Walker is okay. Camilo Duvall is still out there, although he lost his job last year.
Jelly is pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah, well, actually, Hajeli's he's an ex-Met, and I don't know why he's in the major leagues. Actually,
we had a good year for them last year.
I don't know.
And you've got a great catcher, at least defensively, in Patrick Bailey.
Right. Bailey is, I think, the real deal back there.
Defensively, he certainly is. I mean, you're still not thrilled with running Lamont Wade Jr. and Wilmer Flores out there as your first base.
I got to hand it to Wilmer Flores, by the way.
This
dude has a job still in the major leagues, and he still can hit left-handed pitching. He's just a masher, and I just love that player. I just do.
I think the Giant fans love Tyler Fitzgerald at second.
Yeah, I think he had that sort of a few weeks where it's like, wow, this guy's going to be.
Right, and you're hoping for a big combo up the middle between him and Willie Adames. That who knows where that could lift that.
That's a nice left side of the infield, having Matt Chapman and Adames, who because he doesn't have to cover as much ground with Matt Chapman there,
you feel a little bit better about that.
I think that's what makes that a particularly good move for the Giants.
I think where you fall down on the Giants a little bit is when you get to the outfield, because it's just like you love Ramos out and left.
I'll be honest with you, I don't love any of the Giant outfielders.
Yastrzemski, McCray.
Like, we're just putting guys out there.
You're kind of waiting for Jung-Hoo Lee to come back, and you don't know when that's going to be because he had that nasty injury last season.
Yeah, I don't think he's going to start the season. That's for sure,
he's not starting the season. I don't know when. Let me look when he see who's going to be back.
But yeah, they have the other Encarnacion, Jera Encarnacion, who will also do some DHing. And that's what I mean. No shade on the Giants, but when Wilmer Flores is your part-time DH, you think, we've been doing that for a while and we haven't been winning. Maybe we should try something else. So yeah, I'm just, and it's just a ridiculous division, right, to try to do that with, because it's not the Padres, which I think will be the biggest problem. The Dodgers certainly would be, but I think the Diamondbacks are a lot better this year too.
Right, and the Diamondbacks are probably thinking, well, we can't get as bad a year as we got out of Jordan Montgomery as we did last year.
Well, I think the nice thing about their pitching is that I don't think they need to get much out of Jordan Montgomery, because they went out and they brought in Corbin Burnes.
And
so Zach Allen is now your number 2.
Right, that takes a lot.
Ooh, it's not Merrill Kelly as your number 2.
Right. And you didn't get anything at Eduardo Rodriguez.
You got nothing out of Eduardo Rodriguez, so you're hoping to get something.
So it's almost like you got like a double free agent signing by having him come back. I think I still have questions about that bullpen.
Right, and Ginkel actually is way better than you think. But after that, Joe Mantiply, he's sort of a situational, left-hander. I don't know that you think he's a guy who's going to finish games. A.J. Puck and Ryan Thompson and Justin Martinez, they're all okay.
Now when you look at that Diamondback lineup, especially with I like the move of replacing
Me too.
Christian Walker with Josh Naylor. I think that's a good move. Gabby Moreno had a great second.
He had a great second. He had a really good year. I didn't realize
Ketel
that.
Marte had an unbelievable last year.
He's like
Cattell.
MVP candidate.
Right.
Eugenio
Suarez picked it up after a slow start.
Yeah, Eugenio didn't have the season that you'd like him to have, and I think I think you could expect him to do better this year.
And you can live with Perdomo because he fields well.
Perdomo had a good year.
Right. And so even if he takes a step back, you're still okay with it. And then between Lourdes Gurriel Jr., Corbin Carroll, and McCarthy, whatever they're doing in center is generally good enough.
Yeah, I think Alec Thomas, who's still on the roster, was a little disappointing because I thought he was going to be a better player. I love Carroll. I expect a lot of him. Randall Grichuk is an unheralded signing who actually had a really good year last year.
I think it could be a big deal for them because he gives them another right-handed bat when a lot of their backup outfielders are lefty, including Corbin Carroll. Having another right-handed bat you can put out there is going to help on days where you're going to – because otherwise left-handed pitching would be extremely effective against this Diamondback.
And they're only 2 seasons removed from going to the World Series, so I just think that the Diamondbacks they got better in a division where you need to get better because you're playing there with the Dodgers, and I think that they will be a team that will be there playing for the playoffs at the end of the season.
And you could very much see a situation where whichever team between the Diamondbacks, the Padres, and the Giants blinks first or gets off to a slow start, you could just be out of it because there's not going to be a chance to catch up to those other teams.
That's true if you go out one of those crazy, Detroit Tiger 35-5 starts or something like that they did.
Or
in
you do the
1984.
reverse. You have a Mets April-May. You might not be able to pick it up and play well enough down the stretch because the Mets April-May was kind of helped out that they played the Phillies and the Braves a ton in that stretch. So then when they started to play better, they didn't have to play those teams at all.
Yeah, there was a stretch of games where they didn't have the tough schedule, and they made the most of it. So that leaves the team from Colorado who did what the team from Colorado seems to do every year.
You're being very nice calling them a team. I think a collection of baseball players.
Which is to say
closer.
nothing.
They're a group of loosely affiliated men that show up and attempt to play baseball
So
regularly.
I'm going to name these players, and I don't know if you're looking at the roster. So if I had to say to people, Ryan Feltner, Austin Gomber, Kyle Freeland, Antonio Sanzatella, Bradley Blaylock, and Herman Marquez. What position do they play? Right.
Oh, I thought you were naming a U.S. diplomatic delegation, not the Colorado Rockies.
That is the starting rotation for the Colorado Rockies. And by the way,
it doesn't get more recognizable when you go to the bullpen.
Nobody wants to pitch here. Apparently, nobody.
And it's like they do have some exciting position players,
they have players other teams would want.
Right, Ezekiel Tovar, people were interested in.
Sure,
Ryan
he won the Gold Glove.
Brenton Doyle are all players.
They're talking about signing Doyle to a long-term contract, by the way. So we got to. Well, I don't know. You get the hit in Colorado. Chris Bryant is still a Colorado Rocky. He's. He's going to turn 33 this year.
He feels ancient.
It feels like he should be 50.
I imagine him limping out onto the field with a cane and
that's what
hair.
he does is limp on the field and all that stuff. Boy, talk about and before that happened, it didn't seem like a terrible idea for him to go to Colorado where if you like to hit, wouldn't you want to hit in Colorado?
It's just impressive to me that a team that's going to play in the equivalent of a single A stadium in Sacramento isn't the most hopeless team in baseball because I have to give that to the Rockies.
Well, we're not picking teams here now, so you're tipping your hand here.
But I'm looking at this roster, and what is there to be excited about on this roster?
You're not going to say Nolan Jones is not exciting to you? So it was to the Rockies when they brought him in there. So, yeah, it's a tough situation for them. And, by the way, they'll be probably, we're not picking, but I bet you they're 10 games out by the end of April because that's a tough division to do it. So,
but spring training is underway. Pitchers and catchers are reporting. It is exciting times for baseball fans. And soon we're going to get those first reports of who looks great in spring training and is in the best shape of their lives.
And the best thing is we didn't talk about Scott Boras at all.